The one man with any objection to living under canvas was our senior military assistant, who preferred to sleep in his car. Unfortunately, he had to leave his long legs sticking out through the door, with the result that he could never get his wet boots off after a rainy night. We always used to pitch our little camp in a wood or a copse near the main axis of advance, if possible by a lake or stream, so that we could take a quick plunge before breakfast, or whenever we came back caked with dust and grime from a trip to the front. While the Chief of Staff naturally had to stay behind the command post to deal with the work and telephone calls, I spent the days, and often part of the nights, out on the road. I usually left early in the morning after receiving the dawn situation reports and issuing any orders that were necessary to visit divisions and forward troops. At noon I would return to the command post for a while and then go out to visit another division, for as often as not it is just around eventide that success beckons or a fresh impetus is needed. By the time we returned to our tented camp, which would meanwhile have been shifted to a new location, we were dead tired and as black as sweeps. On such occasions it was a special treat to find that, thanks to the forethought of Major Niemann, my second assistant, we were to have a roast chicken or even a bottle of wine from his own small stock instead of the usual evening fare of rye bread, smoked sausage and margarine. I am afraid that however far forward we were, chickens and geese were very hard to come by, having as a rule been snapped up by other fanciers before we appeared on the scene. When, with the onset of the early autumn rains, it became rather too chilly to sit in the tents, we found it both pleasant and refreshing to use the sauna baths, which, however primitive in form, were to be found on almost every farmstead. Such flexible leadership on my part was, of course, possible only because I was able to take a wireless vehicle along with me on these trips under our excellent signals officer Kohler, who later became a general staff major. Thanks to the admirable speed with which he could raise our tactical staff or any divisional headquarters on the air, I was kept continuously informed of the situation throughout the Corps sector, and decisions taken by me on the spot could be passed back with the minimum of delay. I might add that during my imprisonment after the war, Kohler proved a most unselfish friend and helper to my wife. Apart from my faithful drivers Nagel and Schumann and 2 outriders, my constant companion on these trips was my ADC, Lieutenant Specht. We called him Peppo because of his short, wiry figure and his youthful freshness and happy-go-lucky nature. He was a young cavalry officer of the best type, brisk, vigorous, somewhat irresponsible where danger was concerned, shrewd and quick on the uptake. He was always cheerful and slightly saucy. All these qualities had endeared him to me. He rode brilliantly. His father was a keen horse breeder, his mother a first-class horsewoman, and had won several big events as a newly commissioned officer just before the war. He was game for anything, and would have liked nothing better than to take his commanding general out on skirmishing patrols. As long as we belonged to a Panzer Corps and could be daily at the scene of action, Peppo was content with me and his lot, but when I became an army commander and could no longer be up at the front so often, he began to champ at the bit. It was a very proper attitude for a young officer, and I gave him his head on a number of occasions. In the Crimea, he twice led a reconnaissance squadron with great skill and dash. When we were in front of Leningrad, I again sent him to a division, but this time he crashed while on his way there in a Fieseler Storch. The loss was a heavy blow to me. Now let us return to 56 Panzer Corps. By 9th July, it had become clear that 4th Panzer Group's attempt to outflank the enemy forces, it believed to be at Pskov by sending our corps round to the east, had no hope of success on account of the marshiness of the ground and the strength of the enemy's resistance. There was nothing for it but to discontinue the manoeuvre and redirect Corps HQ and 8th Panzer Division onto the original northern axis towards Ostrov, as had already been done with 3 motorized infantry division. Still, since moving off from Dvinsk, the Corps had, according to intelligence reports available on 10th of July, smashed 4 or 5 of the enemy's infantry divisions, 1 armoured division and 1 motorized division, forces far superior to its own numerically. Apart from the thousands of prisoners we had taken, Our booty since crossing the Reich frontiers included 60 aircraft, 316 guns, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft, 205 tanks and 600 lorries. But the enemy, though pushed back to the east, was still not destroyed, as was very soon to become apparent. Now that the Panzer Group was concentrated around Ostrov, we at 56 Panzer Corps hoped for a rapid, direct and uniform advance on Leningrad, with ourselves passing through Luga and 41 Panzer Corps through Pskov. In our view, this offered the best chance not only of effecting the quick capture of the city, but also of cutting off the enemy forces retreating through Livonia into Estonia before our 18th Army. The task of safeguarding this operation on its open eastern flank would have had to devolve on 16th Army as it moved up behind 4th Panzer Group. Presumably acting on directives from the highest level, however, Panzer Group HQ decided otherwise. 41 Panzer Corps was allotted the main road through Luga along which to advance on Leningrad. 56 Panzer Corps, once again pulling out to the east, was to advance through Porkhov and Novgorod to Chudovo in order to break communications between Leningrad and Moscow at the earliest possible date. Important though the latter task was, these orders must once again have led to the two corps becoming widely dispersed, as a result of which each was liable to be deprived of the necessary striking power. The danger was increased by the fact that much of the country to be crossed this side of Leningrad was marshy or wooded and hardly suitable for large armoured formations. A particularly regrettable step was the removal from 56 Panzer Corps of the SS Death's Head Division, which had meanwhile been relieved in the Zebesh-Opochka area by 290 Infantry Division. The SS Division was now retained south of Ostrov as the Panzer Group Reserve. Thus, as had previously happened when we set off from the German frontier, the Panzer Group's main effort was again placed on its left wing, 41 Panzer Corps. 56 Panzer Corps was dispatched on its wide sweep round to Chudovo with only one armoured and one infantry division, thereby being denied the essential protection of its open south flank by the SS Division following along in echelon on the right. It was a particularly risky move when one considered that even though the enemy forces engaged by the Corps to date had been outfought, they were far from annihilated. Be that as it may, we were still convinced that the Corps would continue to find its safety in speed of movement. 3. Motorized Division, which only came back under command at Ostrov, had already taken Porkhov on 10th of July after a hard struggle, and was put on a minor road leading north. 8 Panzer Division was to drive through Zoltsi to seize the vital crossing point where the Mashaga ran into Lake Ilmen. In a series of battles, most of them fierce ones, the advance was kept going for the next few days. Except for one attack on the Corps command post on the north bank of the Shelon River in the early hours of 14th of July, apparently carried out by enemy reconnaissance forces, the enemy had so far not made his presence felt on our open flank in the south. That same day, at my insistence, 8 Panzer Division, which had taken Zoltsi after a battle against an enemy well equipped with artillery and armour, pushed on to the Mashaga sector. It found the bridge already blown. Meanwhile, Panzer Group HQ had transferred the main effort of its advance even further west of the Luga road. It had moved 41 Panzer Corps' 3 mechanised formations northwards to bar the way to the enemy forces retiring through Narva, north of Lake Peipus, before 18th Army. Only one infantry division of the Corps, the 269th, had been left on the road to Luga. Thus, 56 Panzer Corps suddenly found itself even more isolated than before in its wide swing towards Chudovo. Accordingly, we got on to Panzer Corps HQ, to point out that if we were to carry out the Chudovo assignment, our corps must have the immediate support both of the SS Death's Head Division and also of 16th Army's 1 Corps, which was relatively close behind. Before this appeal could be answered, however, 56 Panzer Corps was already in trouble. Early on 15th of July, we received a number of most unpleasant reports at the Corps command post on the Shelon, west of Zoltsi. The enemy had launched a powerful attack from the north into the flank of 8 Panzer Division, now strung out to the Mashaga, and simultaneously driven up from the south over the Shillong. This meant that the bulk of 8 Panzer Division's fighting troops, who were located between Zoltsi and the Mashaga, were cut off from the division's rear echelons, in whose area Corps HQ was located. But that was not all. The enemy had closed the trap behind ourselves too, by pushing up strong forces from the south to straddle our supply route. At the same time, 3 motorized division, advancing further northwards, found itself being attacked by superior enemy forces from the north and northeast at Mali Utagorsk. It was obviously the enemy's intention to encircle 56 Panzer Corps while it was isolated. The failure to echelon the SS Death's Head Division along our rear right flank had enabled him to attack across the Shillong with those of his forces which lay south of us. At the same time, the removal of 41 Panzer Corps from the Luga road had released the strong enemy forces there, and these were now attacking our northern flank. Our corps' position at that moment was hardly an enviable one, and we could not help wondering whether we had taken rather too great a risk this time. Had we been carried away by our previous successes to the extent of paying insufficient heed to the enemy on our southern flank? Yet what other chance should we have of carrying out our mission? As matters stood, the only course open to us was to pull 8 Panzer Division back through Zoltsi to escape the encirclement that now threatened. 3. Motorized division had to be disengaged at the same time to give the corps back its freedom of movement. The next few days proved critical, with the enemy straining every nerve to keep up his encirclement and throwing in, besides his rifle divisions, 2 armoured divisions enjoying strong artillery and air support. 8 Panzer Division nevertheless managed to break through Zoltsi to the west and regroup, despite having to be temporarily supplied from the air. Before completing its own disengagement, 3 motorized division had to beat off 17 successive attacks. In the meantime, after Panzer Group HQ had put the SS Death's Head Division under our command, it was possible for us to clear the corps supply route. By 18th July, the crisis was as good as over, the corps being by then firmly established around Dino on a front facing roughly east by northeast. The earlier danger on our open flank in the south was removed by the proximity of 16th Army's 1 Corps, which was now drawing near Dino. One consolation was afforded us by the capture from a courier aircraft of a letter bearing the signature of Marshal Voroshilov, whom I had met in Moscow in 1931 and who now commanded the front opposite us. This not only confirmed that very substantial elements of the Soviet armies had been wiped out, but in the same connection referred specifically to the battles around Zoltsi. As long as we had been surrounded, our only links with the rear had been at best by wireless or aircraft. The very moment our lines of communication were restored, however, the usual plethora of paper descended on us. One item deserving special mention was an ominous inquiry telegraphed through from the Supreme Command. Moscow radio, in somewhat premature celebration of our corps' encirclement, had reported the capture of certain top-secret data on our multiple rocket launcher. The Soviets had obviously taken an intense dislike to this new weapon, with which we were able to fire missiles of flaming oil. Already the Soviet army facing us had wirelessed a warning en clair that if we did not stop using it, they would retaliate with gas. An empty threat, of course, in view of the complete inadequacy of their own chemical warfare defences. In these circumstances, it was understandable that they should make such a song and dance about the capture of this information. Now we were being called upon to explain how a top-secret document could possibly fall into enemy hands. Obviously it had not been taken from the fighting troops, but from a transport column intercepted by the Soviets when they cut our supply route. This sort of thing was liable to happen to any armoured formation operating far ahead of its army front. In response to the Supreme Command's inquiry, we duly reported the facts of the case, adding that to avoid any further censure, we would henceforth refrain from cruising around on our own, some 60 miles behind the enemy lines. On 19th July, we had been informed by Panzer Group HQ that it now planned to send 56 Panzer Corps through Luga to Leningrad. 269 Infantry Division, which was assembled on the Luga road, had already been placed under our command. We still had no success with our proposal that the forces of the Panzer Group be at long last concentrated for concerted action, preferably up north with 41 Panzer Corps east of Narva, where there were 4 serviceable roads to Leningrad, rather than along the Luga axis, which ran through extensive woodlands. For the rest, we were first to launch an attack eastwards with 1 corps against the Mishaga sector, which we had already reached once before. Apparently the Supreme Command was still sticking to its plan for a wide outflanking movement, and was even prepared to go round to the east of Lake Ilmen. For the time being, therefore, we and First Corps were involved in fresh battles, in the course of which the enemy was thrown back across the Mishaga. On 20th July, we had a visit from the Oberquartiermeister Wiend of OKH, General Paulus. I put him in the picture about the battles we had fought to date, and pointed out how run down our Panzer Corps had become in country which was most unsuitable for the use of armoured troops. I also drew his attention to the disadvantages of scattering the Panzer Group's resources. The losses of our Corps' 3 mobile divisions already amounted to 6,000 men, and both the troops and equipment were being subjected to excessive strain, even though 8 Panzer Division had been able, during a few days' rest, to bring the number of its serviceable tanks back from 80 up to the 150 marks. I told Paulus that, in my opinion, the best thing to do would be to withdraw the entire Panzer Group from an area where a rapid advance was almost out of the question, and to use it against Moscow. If, on the other hand, the idea of driving on Leningrad and executing a wide encircling movement through Chudovo were to be maintained, it was essential that infantry be made available. Once the wooded zone had been cleared, our own corps must be saved for the final thrust on the city, otherwise the mobile divisions would reach Leningrad in no fit state for fighting. In any case, I pointed out, such an operation would take time. If we wanted to gain swift possession of Leningrad and the coastline, the only thing to do was to concentrate the whole Panzer Group up north in the area east of Narva, whence it could drive straight for the city. General Paulus entirely agreed with my views. Initially, however, things turned out quite differently. While 16th Army, consisting of 1 corps and another corps which had just arrived, took over the Mishaga front west of Lake Ilmen, it was decided after all that 56 Panzer Corps should now carry out the thrust on Leningrad up the route through Luga. For this purpose, we were allotted 3 motorized infantry division, 269 infantry division, and the newly arrived SS Police Division. This had the effect of dispersing the Panzer Group's mechanized forces further than ever. The SS Death's Head Division remained with 16th Army by Lake Ilmen, and 8 Panzer Division was taken into reserve by the Panzer Group to be initially employed on clearing the communications zone of partisans, a role for which it was not only far too valuable, but also quite unsuitable. The Corps now had only 1 mobile division, 3 motorized, in the Luga area, while 41 Panzer Corps' own 3 were in action east of Narva. The maxim established by Colonel General Guderian on the use of armour was "Klotzen, nicht klecken," don't spatter, boot 'em. In our own case, the very opposite course seemed to have been taken. All our efforts to retain the 3 mobile divisions, irrespective of which way our corps was sent, proved unsuccessful. Experience has long shown that when forces run short, only very few commanders manage to maintain a tidy order of battle and avoid splitting their formations. It would take up too much space here if I were to describe the battles around Luga. They proved very tough indeed. While the enemy had had only a very modest number of troops available in this area a few weeks previously, he had now brought his strength up to a full corps of 3 divisions supported by strong artillery and armour. To cap this, the country around Luga was a Russian training area, with which, of course, the enemy was intimately acquainted, and in addition he had had time to dig himself in properly. While these battles were still in progress, our corps was given a new task. At long last, it was to join up with 41 Panzer Corps in the north for the assault on Leningrad. Even now, however, only Corps HQ and 3 motorized division were involved. 8 Panzer and the SS Death's Head Division were to continue in their present role. On 15th of August, we handed over at Luga to HQ 50 Corps under General Lindemann, an old friend of mine from World War I days, and began moving north. The route to our new command post on Lake Samro, 25 miles southwest of Narva, was so bad that we took 8 hours to travel a distance of 125 miles. We had hardly reached Lake Samro late that evening when a telephone call was received from Panzer Group HQ, ordering us to halt 3 motorized division, which was coming up behind us, and to drive straight down south again next morning to report to HQ 16th Army in Dino. We, together with 3 motorized division and the SS Death's Head Division, which was being pulled over from Lake Ilmen, were now to join that formation. No one will pretend that we were particularly pleased at these peregrinations. The one admirable exception was our quartermaster, Major Kleinschmidt, whose cheerful equanimity was quite undaunted by the news that he would have to swing his supply and transport arrangements round through an angle of 180 degrees. So, on 16th of August, we moved back to Dino along the same dreadful route we had covered the day before. This time the distance was 160 miles, and we took 13 hours to do it. Luckily, 3 motorized had not come too far north and could be turned round in good time, but what the troops thought of it all I do not care to imagine. The ultimate reason for the change was probably that our sum total of forces was inadequate, and that the whole area between Leningrad, Pskov and Lake Ilmen was thoroughly unsuitable as tank country. The picture we were given on our arrival at HQ 16th Army was the following. 10 corps, fighting on the right wing of the army south of Lake Ilmen, had been attacked and pushed back by far superior enemy forces. 38th Soviet Army, comprising 8 divisions and cavalry formations. It was now fighting a difficult defensive battle south of Lake Ilmen, on a front facing south, with the enemy obviously trying to outflank it in the west. 56 Panzer Corps was to provide the urgently needed relief. Map 9. What our corps had to do, if possible without attracting the attention of the enemy, was to introduce its 2 mechanized divisions into his western flank east of Dino in order to roll up the front while he was busy attacking our own 10 corps in the north. The task confronting us was a pretty one, and it was gratifying to see how pleased the SS were to come back under our command. It was only a pity that we could not get 8 Panzer Division released for such a worthwhile operation. By 18th August, the carefully concealed move of the 2 divisions into camouflaged assembly areas in the enemy's western flank had been successfully completed, and when the corps unleashed its attack early next day, the enemy was obviously taken completely by surprise. Our plan to roll up the enemy front from the flank proved entirely successful, and in the engagements that followed, we and 10 corps, which had now returned to the attack, jointly succeeded in roundly defeating 38th Soviet Army. By 22nd August, we had reached the Lovat southeast of Staraya Russa, despite the fact that in that sandy terrain, with its almost complete absence of roads, the infantry of the 2 motorized divisions had had to advance most of the way on foot. During those few days, 56 Panzer Corps alone captured 12,000 prisoners, 141 tanks, 246 guns, and several hundred automatic weapons and motor vehicles. The booty included 2 extremely interesting items. One was a brand new 8.8 cm anti-aircraft battery of German manufacture from the year 1941. The other was the very first Soviet salvo gun to fall into German hands. As I was most anxious to have the latter evacuated, I was all the more indignant to find that it could not be moved because somebody had helped himself to the tyres. The offender proved to be none other than my second assistant, Major Niemann, who had discovered that these tyres fitted our own command wagon. He looked somewhat crestfallen when told to hand them back for reassembly, while the fighting troops, who once again had to exert themselves to the utmost, were enjoying a brief rest on the Lovat. There was talk of withdrawing 56 Panzer Corps for employment elsewhere. But then 16th Army's eastward advance south of Lake Ilmen was resumed after all. At the end of August, however, the first rains of that summer set in, turning every road into such a quagmire that for a while both motorized divisions were completely stuck. At the same time, the enemy moved up new forces. In lieu of his beaten 38th Army, 3 new armies appeared along the Kulm-Ilmen front opposite our own 16th Army, the 27th, 34th and 11th. Fresh battles ensued, but to describe these in detail would take up too much space. 56 Panzer Corps forced a crossing over the Pola and pushed on to a point just short of Demyansk. Quite apart from the fact that enemy resistance was stiffening, the painful effort of advancing a long road several feet deep in mud imposed a particular strain on both men and equipment. During this period, the whole of my time was spent out with my divisions, but even my sturdy Kubelwagen often had to be towed by a tractor to make any headway on those so-called roads. During this period, even we came to feel the divergence between the aims pursued by Hitler, Leningrad, and OKH, Moscow. The commander of 16th Army, Colonel General Busch, told me he intended to push east as far as the Valdai Heights so that he could later advance in the direction Kalinin-Moscow. It seemed that HQ Northern Army Group did not agree, principally because it was worried by the prospect of bearing the army's eastern flank. While at the beginning of September, 57 Panzer Corps intervened in our operations from the area of Central Army Group in the south, we ourselves were told on 12th of September that we would shortly be moved south with 3 motorized division to come under command of 9th Army in Central Army Group. Even as a corps commander, one could make neither head nor tail of all this chopping and changing, though I did form the impression that it was all ultimately due to the tug-of-war evidently going on between Hitler and OKH over whether the strategic aim should be Moscow or Leningrad. At all events, the battles which 16th Army fought in those weeks with 56 Panzer Corps taking part were continuously successful, and on 16th of September, OKW was able to announce the defeat of substantial elements of the 11th, 27th and 34th Soviet armies. 9 enemy divisions were considered to have been destroyed, and 9 more badly battered. We still failed to find any real satisfaction in these achievements, however, for no one was clear any longer what the actual aim of our strategy was, or what higher purpose all these battles were supposed to serve. Whatever else might happen, the period of sensational advances of the kind we had made on Dvinsk was at an end. My days at the head of 56 Panzer Corps were now numbered. On the evening of 12th of September, under a steady downpour of rain, I was sitting in my tent with 1 or 2 officers of my staff. Ever since it had begun to get dark early, we had taken to playing bridge to while away the time until the evening situation reports came in. Suddenly the telephone rang at my elbow, and I was asked to take a call from my friend Busch, the army commander. A telephone message at this late hour did not usually bode anything pleasant, but on this occasion Busch read me out an order that had come over the teleprinter from OKH. General of the Infantry versus Manstein will leave forthwith for Southern Army Group to assume command of 11th Army. Every soldier will sense how proud and happy I felt at the prospect of leading a whole army from now on. To me, at the time, this seemed the peak of my military career. Early next morning I took leave, only by telephone, unfortunately, of the divisions under my command, and then bade farewell to my own staff. In doing so, I had grateful memories of all that 56 Panzer Corps and its staff had achieved in the past months, when the headquarters and divisions had grown into a thoroughly integrated unit. Joyful though I was in taking over this new and bigger task, I was nevertheless fully aware that probably the most satisfying phase of my life as a soldier was now over. For 3 whole months I had lived close to the fighting troops, sharing not only their trials and tribulations, but also the pride of their successes. Time and again I had been able to derive fresh energy from the very fact of this common experience, from the cheerful devotion with which everyone went about his duty, and from the intimacy of comradeship. From now on, my position would prevent me from working among the troops to the extent I had done to date. It was unlikely that I should ever again live through anything comparable to the impetuous dash of 56 Panzer Corps in the first days of the campaign, the fulfillment of all a tank force commander's dreams. I thus found the leave-taking extremely hard, most of all from my experienced Chief of Staff, Colonel Baron V's Elverfelt, a cool, high-minded and never-failing counsellor. The same applied to my high-spirited and talented Chief of Operations, Major Detlefsen, the head of my intelligence branch, Guido versus Kessel, and that indefatigable quartermaster, Major Kleinschmidt. Another of those I had to leave behind me was the head of my Adjutant General's branch, Major V.D. Marwitz, who had joined us only a few weeks previously, and with whom I had close ties of friendship dating back to the days we had spent together in Pomerania and at the military academy. When I left on the morning of 13th of September to take formal leave of my friend Bush, the only people I could take with me were my ADC, Specht, and my two drivers, Nagel and Schumann. Not one of them is alive today. If I now attempt to describe the battles fought in the Crimea by 11th Army and its Romanian fellow combatants, my main reason for doing so is to commemorate my comrades of the Crimean Army. At the same time, I should like to give the men who survived those battles a general account of the events of which they could have had only an incomplete picture at the time. These men put up a tremendous performance in the period 1941-2, fighting one battle after another against an adversary who almost invariably outnumbered them. In attack and pursuit, their aggressive spirit was unparalleled, and when the situation appeared hopeless, they would stand and fight unflinchingly. Often they may not have known what compelled us to make demands on them that seemed impossible to fulfill, or why they were flung from one action to another and from one front to the next. And yet they went to the very limit of endurance to carry out these demands, reciprocating the trust of those who led them. But 11th Army's campaign in the Crimea also deserves attention outside the immediate circle of its participants, for it is one of the few cases where an army was still able to operate independently in a segregated theatre of war, left to its own devices and free of interference from the Supreme Command. It was a campaign which, in 10 months of incessant fighting, included both offensive and defensive battles, mobile warfare with full freedom of action, a headlong pursuit operation, landings by an enemy in control of the sea, partisan engagements, and an assault on a powerfully defended fortress. Finally, the campaign is of interest because it was fought over the Black Sea Peninsula, which even today bears traces of the Greeks, Goths, Genoese, and Tartars. Once before, in the War of 1854-6, this had been a focal point of history, and the names of places which played a role then, the Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, and Malakoff, will be heard here all over again. Operationally, however, the War of 1854-6 can in no way be compared with the campaign fought in 1941-2. In the former case, the Western powers enjoyed naval supremacy and all the advantages this implies, whereas in the Crimean campaign of 1941-2, it was the Russians who controlled the Black Sea. Our 11th Army had not only to conquer the Crimea and Sevastopol, but also to contend with all the possibilities open to the Russians by reason of their mastery at sea. On 17 September 1941, I arrived at 11th Army HQ in Nikolaev, the Russian naval base at the mouth of the Bug, and took over command. My predecessor, Colonel General Ritter versus Schobert, had been buried in the city the day before. On one of his daily visits to the front, he had landed on a Russian minefield in his Fieseler Storch aircraft, and both he and his pilot had been killed. In him, the German army lost an officer of great integrity and one of its most experienced front-line soldiers. His troops would have followed him anywhere. HQ 11th. Army, whose operations staff was later to form the headquarters of Don Army Group, was almost without exception a superb team of men, and I have grateful memories of the assistance I received from so many splendid officers in 2.5 tough years of war. We got on extraordinarily well together, and when I relinquished my command in 1944, many of them did not want to remain on the staff. The novelty of my new position did not end with the expansion of my sphere of command from an army corps into an army. I did not discover until I reached Nikolaev that in addition to 11th Army, I was also to take over 3rd Romanian Army, which was affiliated to it. For political reasons, the actual chain of command in this part of the Eastern Front had not been easy to arrange. Command of the Allied forces committed from Romania, 3rd and 4th Romanian Armies and 11th German Army, had been entrusted to the Romanian head of state, Marshal Antonescu, but at the same time he was bound by the directives of Southern Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Verser Rundstedt, HQ. 11th Army had been acting as the connecting link between the Marshal and Army Group HQ, and had advised him on operational matters. By the time I arrived, however, the situation was such that Antonescu only retained control of 4th Romanian Army, which he had directed to attack Odessa. The other Romanian army taking part in the campaign, the 3rd, had been placed under the command of 11th Army, which henceforth took its orders directly from HQ Southern Army Group. At the best of times, it is embarrassing for an army headquarters to have to control another self-contained army in addition to its own, and the task was necessarily twice as difficult when the army in question happened to be an Allied one. What made things harder still was that there were not only certain differences of organisation, training and leadership between the two armies, as is always the case where allies are concerned, but also a noticeable contrast in their fighting qualities. From time to time, this led us to take a firmer hand in our allies' handling of an operation than was usual with our own forces or desirable in the interest of good relations. That we were able, despite these difficulties, to collaborate with the Romanian headquarters staffs and fighting units without any real friction occurring was primarily due to the loyalty of the commander of 3rd Romanian Army, General, later Colonel General, Dumitrescu. The German liaison teams, which we had attached to all Romanian staffs down to divisional level, also contributed by their tact, and when necessary by their firmness, to this cooperation. The man most deserving of mention in this respect, however, is Marshal Antonescu. Whatever verdict posterity may pass on him as a politician, Antonescu was a real patriot, a good soldier, and certainly our most loyal ally. He was a soldier who, having once bound up his country's destiny with that of the Reich, did everything possible until his overthrow to put Romania's military power and war potential to effective use on our side. If this did not always work out quite as he had hoped, the reason was to be found in the internal circumstances of his state and his regime. At all events, he remained faithful to his allies, and I can only speak with gratitude of our work together. As for the Romanian army, there is no doubt that it had considerable weaknesses. Although the Romanian soldier, who was usually of peasant origin, was modest in his wants and usually a capable, brave fighter, the possibilities of training him as an individual fighting man who could think for himself in action, let alone as a non-commissioned officer, were to a great extent limited by the low standard of general education in Romania. In cases where members of the German minority did come up to the necessary standard, Romanian national prejudice tended to impede any advancement. Neither were such outmoded practices as flogging likely to improve the quality of the rank and file. Their effect was rather to make Romanian soldiers of German stock do everything they could to join one of the German armed services, or, since the latter were not allowed to accept them, the Waffen-SS. One disadvantage, as far as the inner stability of Romanian troops was concerned, was the absence of a non-commissioned officer corps as we know it. I am afraid people in Germany nowadays are all too ready to forget what a debt we have owed in the past to our excellent body of regular NCOs. Another factor of far-reaching importance was that a considerable proportion of the Romanian officers holding senior and medium appointments were not up to requirement. Most of all, the Romanians lacked that close link between officers and men, which tends to be taken for granted in the German army. Man management with them was entirely devoid of the Prussian tradition. Because they had no war experience, the combat training of the Romanians fell short of the exigencies of modern warfare. This led to unnecessary losses, which in turn was bound to affect morale. The military leaders, who had been under French influence since 1918, still thought in terms of World War I. Weapons and equipment were partly obsolete and also inadequate. This was particularly true of the anti-tank units, with the result that they could hardly be expected to hold their ground against Soviet tank attacks. Whether Germany could not have rendered more effective help in this respect is a question for others to decide. One final drawback regarding the use of Romanian troops on the Eastern Front was their terrific respect for the Russians. In difficult situations, this was liable to end in a panic. Indeed, it is a problem of which account must be taken in any war against Russia involving Southeast European nations. In the case of the Bulgarians and Serbs, the insecurity is increased by their sense of Slavonic affinity. There was one other factor that could not be entirely disregarded in any assessment of the combat efficiency of Romanian troops. At the time with which we are dealing, Romania had already attained her fundamental war aim, the reconquest of Bessarabia. Even Transnistria, the territory between the Dniester and Bug, which she had been persuaded to accept by Hitler, did not really lie within the scope of Romania's aspirations. It was understandable that the idea of pushing even further into the Russia they dreaded so much was none too warmly received by many Romanians. Despite all the defects and reservations mentioned above, however, the Romanian troops performed their duty as best they could. Above all, they always readily submitted to German military leadership and did not, like other allies of ours, put matters of prestige before material necessity. Undoubtedly, the soldierly mentality of Marshal Antonescu exerted a decisive influence in this respect. To sum up, the verdict given me at the time by my advisers was that in the event of any substantial losses, 3rd Romanian Army would cease to be capable of offensive action and only be fit for defence if reinforced by German corset bones. The sector I had to command formed the southernmost wing of the Eastern Front. Broadly speaking, it embraced the Crimea and the part of the Dnieper Bend south of Zaporozhye. There was no direct contact with the main forces of Southern Army Group advancing north of the Dnieper, which was all to the good as far as 11th Army's operational freedom was concerned. After the forest tracts of northern Russia, in which I had last had to operate with a tank corps unsuited to that type of country, I now found myself in the vast expanses of the steppes, which were almost entirely devoid of natural obstacles, even if they did not offer any cover either. It was ideal tank country, but unfortunately 11th Army had no tanks. The only variety was offered by the smaller rivers, the beds of which dried up in summertime to form deep, steep-banked fissures known as bulkers. Nevertheless, the very monotony of the steppes gave them a strange and unique fascination. Everyone was captivated at one time or other by the endlessness of the landscape, through which it was possible to drive for hours on end, often guided only by the compass, without encountering the least rise in the ground or setting eyes on a single human being or habitation. The distant horizon seemed like some mountain ridge behind which a paradise might beckon, but it only stretched on and on. The poles of the Anglo-Iranian telegraph line, built some years before by Siemens, alone served to break the eternal sameness of it all. Yet at sunset these steppes were transformed into a dazzling blaze of colour. In the eastern part of the Nogaisk steppes, around and northeast of Melitopol, one came upon lovely villages with such German names as Karlsruhe and Helenenthal. They lay in the midst of rich fruit plantations, their well-built stone houses bearing witness to a past prosperity. The inhabitants still spoke the purest German, but they were almost all old men, women and children. The men had been deported by the Soviet authorities. The task assigned to 11th Army by the Supreme Command inevitably committed it in two divergent directions. On one hand, by advancing on the right wing of Southern Army Group, it was intended to continue pursuing the enemy as he withdrew eastwards. To this end, the main body of the army was to be brought forward along the north coast of the Sea of Azov in the general direction of Rostov. On the other hand, the army was also meant to take the Crimea, a task given special priority. One reason for this was the favourable effect the capture of the peninsula was expected to have on the attitude of Turkey. Another, even more pressing one, was the threat of the enemy's big Crimean air bases to the Romanian oil fields, so vital to Germany. After the Crimea had been taken, the 11th Army's corps of mountain troops was to move over the Straits of Kerch towards the Caucasus, evidently to reinforce an offensive beyond Rostov. At that time, therefore, the Supreme Command still had pretty far-reaching aims for the 1941 campaign. It was soon to become apparent that the dual role allotted to 11th Army was unrealistic. At the beginning of September, 11th Army had forced a crossing over the lower Dnieper at Berislavl, an exceptional feat of arms in which the main part had been played by 22 Lower Saxon Infantry Division. Nonetheless, it marked the point where the duality of the army's task inevitably brought about a cleavage in its axis of advance. When I took command, I found myself confronted by the following situation. 2 army corps, 30 corps under General Versasalmuth, 72 and 22 infantry divisions and the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and 49 mountain corps under General Kubier, 170 infantry division and 1 and 4 mountain divisions, had continued their eastward pursuit of the enemy after his defeat on the Dnieper and were approaching the line from Melitopol to the Dnieper bend south of Zaporozhye. 1 corps, the 54th under General Hansen, had been diverted to the approach to the Crimea, the Perekop Isthmus. 50 Infantry Division, which had come from Greece, was partly under 4th Romanian Army before Odessa and partly engaged in mopping up the Black Sea coast. 3rd Romanian Army, comprising a mountain corps, 1, 2 and 4 mountain brigades, and a cavalry corps, 5, 6 and 8 cavalry brigades, was still west of the Dnieper, where it proposed to rest for a while. In doing so, it was probably guided by a desire to avoid any advance beyond the river, since it had already exceeded Romania's political aims in having to cross the Bug. Faced with this dual mission of pursuing the enemy eastwards to Rostov and conquering the Crimea for a subsequent drive through Kerch to the Caucasus, 11th Army headquarters had to decide whether to deal with the 2 divergent tasks simultaneously or in chronological order. A decision which was really the responsibility of the Supreme Command was thus left to an army. It seemed quite certain that both tasks could not be solved simultaneously with the forces we had at our disposal. The capture of the Crimea called for a considerably stronger force than 54 Corps, now facing Perekop. Although the intelligence picture indicated that only 3 divisions of the enemy army were likely to have escaped from the Dnieper into the Isthmus, it was not clear what forces the Russians had available in the Crimea itself, particularly at Sevastopol. Soon afterwards it emerged that the enemy could put not 3, but 6 divisions into action in the isthmus itself. These were later to be reinforced by the Soviet army then defending Odessa, i.e. from the sea, Tata. In view of the nature of the ground, however, a stubborn defence by even 3 enemy divisions would probably suffice to deny 54 Corps access to the Crimea, or at least to cause it considerable losses in the fight through the isthmus. The Crimea is divided from the mainland by the so-called Lazy Sea, the Zivash. This is a kind of mudflat or brackish swamp, almost impassable for infantry and an absolute obstacle to assault boats on account of its extreme shallowness. There are only 2 firm approaches to the Crimea, the Isthmus of Perekop in the west and a neck of land running west of Genichesk in the east. The latter is so narrow in places as only to leave room for a causeway and railway embankment, both of which are interspersed with long stretches of bridges. For the purpose of an attack, therefore, it was quite useless. As even the Perekop Isthmus was less than 5 miles wide, the assault would have to be purely frontal and over ground quite devoid of cover. A flanking attack was ruled out by the proximity of the sea on either side. In addition to being already equipped with strong field defences, the isthmus was cut straight across the middle by Tartar's Ditch, an ancient earthwork anything up to 50 feet in depth. Once the Perekop Isthmus had been broken through, there was another bottleneck to be tackled further south at Ishun, where salt lakes reduced the potential assault front to a mere 2 miles. In view of these difficulties on the ground and the enemy's superiority in the air, we had to expect a hard and exhausting struggle. Even if we succeeded in breaking through at Perekop, it was doubtful whether the Corps would still have the strength to fight a second battle at Ishun. In any case, 2 or 3 divisions would never be enough to conquer the whole of Crimea, including Sevastopol. To ensure a swift occupation of Crimea, therefore, the army had at all costs to detach strong additional forces from its pursuit group now heading eastwards. What remained should still suffice for the pursuit as long as the enemy continued to withdraw, though it would be too weak for an objective as remote as Rostov if he were to form a new front further back or actually bring up fresh forces. Should it be considered crucial to advance on Rostov, Crimea would have to be left behind for the time being. In that event, however, it would be difficult to tell when, if ever, the forces needed to conquer the peninsula could be made available. Besides, in the hands of an enemy with command of the sea, Crimea was liable to become a serious menace deep in the flank of the Eastern Front, quite apart from the fact that the air bases would continue to threaten the Romanian oil fields. If the attempt were made to conduct a far-reaching operation towards and beyond Rostov with 2 army corps, and simultaneously to conquer Crimea with 1 other corps, the only result could be that neither objective would be effectively attained. 11th Army accordingly decided to give priority to Crimea. At all costs, we were determined not to tackle this task with insufficient forces. As a matter of course, 54 Corps was given all the available army artillery, engineers and anti-aircraft guns, in addition to which it was to call forward 50 Infantry Division from its rear location at the latest in time for the second phase, the battle for the Ishun Isthmus. But this was still not enough. It was imperative to have a second corps to conquer Crimea quickly after the breakthrough, if indeed it were not actually needed to fight through the lakes at Ishun. We decided that this should be the German Mountain Corps, which the Supreme Command had anyway earmarked in its directives to be moved up through Kerch to the Caucasus later on. Meanwhile, this formation of 2 divisions could be put to better use in the mountainous parts of southern Crimea than out in the steppes. Apart from all this, an attempt was to be made, once we had broken into the peninsula itself, to take the fortress of Sevastopol by a surprise thrust with motorized units. For this purpose, the Leibstandarte was to assemble behind 54 Corps when it went into the assault. These dispositions naturally entailed a considerable weakening of the army's eastern front. All that could be found to replace the forces there, apart from the elements of 22 Infantry Division being used on coastal defence north of Crimea, was 3rd Romanian Army. Despite the Romanian inhibitions to which I alluded earlier, I was able to arrange in a personal talk with General Dumitrescu that his army should be moved quickly forward over the Dnieper. It was perfectly clear that the measures taken by 11th Army would involve considerable risks if the enemy on its eastern front were to halt his retreat and try to regain the initiative there. This was the price that had to be paid if we were to avoid attempting the capture of Crimea with inadequate forces. While supply difficulties caused the preparations for 54 Corps' attack on the Perekop Isthmus to drag on till 24th September, and our forces were still regrouping on the lines already indicated, there were signs of a change in the situation on the army's eastern front from 21st September onwards. The enemy had taken up prepared positions along a front from west of Melitopol to the Dnieper Bend, with the result that the pursuit had to be discontinued. Nonetheless, the army went ahead with the disengagement of the German Mountain Corps, giving orders for the remaining German formations to be mixed in with those of 3rd Romanian Army in order to keep the risk down to a minimum. The Romanian cavalry corps in the southern sector of this front was incorporated into 30 German corps, while 3rd Romanian Army in the north took over 170 German infantry division to bolster the Romanian Mountain Corps. By 24th September 54th Corps was able to move into the assault on the Perekop Isthmus. Though given maximum artillery support, 45 and 73 infantry divisions had the hardest possible conditions to fight under, having to advance in blazing sunshine across salt steppes on which there was no trace of water or cover. The enemy had transformed the isthmus into a powerful 10-mile-deep defence system, and he fought bitterly for every single trench and strong point. Nevertheless, after warding off strong enemy counterattacks, the Corps took Perekop and crossed Tartar's Ditch on 26th September. 3 more days' intensive fighting saw it through the rest of the enemy's defence zone, and after the capture of the strongly defended locality of Armyansk, out into more open country. The enemy fell back between the Ishun lakes, having suffered heavy losses in killed and left 10,000 prisoners, 112 tanks and 135 guns in our hands. But the fruit of this hard-won victory, the final breakout into Crimea, could still not be plucked. Although the enemy's losses had been heavy, the number of divisions facing the corps had meanwhile risen to 6. In all likelihood, any attempt to go straight ahead with the storming of the Ishun bottleneck would have been too much for our troops, in view of the relative strengths involved and the tremendous sacrifices it would have imposed on the German corps. As for 11th Army's proposal to have reinforcements to hand at this juncture in the form of the Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte, the enemy had already thwarted it. Obviously anticipating that we were intent on a speedy conquest of the Crimea, he had brought fresh forces up to his front between the Sea of Azov and the Dnieper. Here, on 26th September, he had attacked our army's eastern front with 2 new armies, the 18th and 9th, consisting of 12 divisions which were mainly new arrivals or recently rested. In the first assault, he had admittedly failed to score any successes against our own 30 Corps, though even here the situation became pretty tense. But in the sector of 3rd Romanian Army, he had overrun the latter's 4 mountain brigade and torn a gap 10 miles wide in the army front. The brigade in question had lost the bulk of its artillery and seemed to be at the end of its tether. Both the other Romanian mountain brigades had also suffered severe losses. We now had no choice but to make the German Mountain Corps, which was already on its way to the Perekop Isthmus, do a right-about turn in order to set about restoring the position of 3rd Romanian Army. Simultaneously, moreover, 11th Army was virtually deprived of the services of its one fast-moving formation, the Leibstandarte, as we were now ordered by the Supreme Command to hold it in hand for the drive on Rostov as part of 1st Panzer Group, to which it would shortly be transferred. We thus had to abstain from using the Leibstandarte to exploit the success in the isthmus, and it was likewise ordered back to the eastern front. In order to be close to the Army's 2 fronts, the Army Operations Branch had on 21st September established a tactical headquarters at Askania Nova in the Nogaisk steppes, which had once been the property of a German family, the Pfalz-Feins. Formerly a model estate known all over Russia, it had now become a collective farm. The manor buildings were sadly neglected, and the retreating Soviet troops had destroyed all the machinery, just as they had thrown petrol over the mountains of threshed wheat lying out in the open air and set them on fire. The latter smouldered for weeks on end without our being able to extinguish them. The increasing gravity of the situation on the Army's front impelled us to move close up behind the danger spot, with a small tactical staff on 29th September. This is always an expedient measure in times of crisis, if only because it prevents subordinate staffs from pulling out early and making a bad impression on the troops. On the occasion in question, it was particularly appropriate in view of the tendency of many Romanian headquarters staffs to change their locations prematurely. The same day, the German Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte delivered a thrust into the enemy's southern flank, where he had broken into 3rd Romanian Army but had failed to exploit his initial success properly. While it was possible to restore the situation in this area, a fresh crisis was brewing on the northern wing of 30 Corps, where a Romanian cavalry brigade had given way. I had to intervene vigorously there and then to prevent its hasty withdrawal. The threatened breakthrough was then parried by swinging round the Leibstandarte to meet it. Tense though the situation on our eastern front had become as a result of the events described above, it also had the makings of a golden opportunity. By launching repeated attacks to frustrate our intentions in the Crimea, the enemy had tied both his armies down on a frontal basis and obviously now had no further reserves with which to protect himself against the Dnieper crossings at Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, whence General versus Kleist's 1st Panzer Group could break out against his northern flank. After I had made representations to Southern Army Group some days previously in favour of an intervention from this quarter, the appropriate orders were issued on 1st October. While 11th Army kept a tight hold on the still attacking enemy, the Panzer Group steadily increased its pressure from the north. Now the enemy began to yield, and by 1st October it was the turn of 30 Corps and 3rd Romanian Army to go over to the attack. In the next few days, in cooperation with 1st Panzer Group, we succeeded in encircling the mass of both enemy armies in the area Bol, Tokmak, Mariupol, Berdiansk, or in destroying them as they retreated. Some 65,000 prisoners, 125 tanks and over 500 guns found their way into German hands on this occasion. Following the Battle of the Sea of Azov, a change was made in the order of battle of the German southern wing. The Supreme Command seemed to have realized that no army could simultaneously fight one operation in the direction of Rostov and another in the Crimea, and from now on the advance on Rostov was entrusted to 1st Panzer Group, to which 11th Army was ordered to hand over 49 Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte. 11th Army was given the sole task of conquering the Crimea with its 2 remaining army corps. Of these, 30 Corps comprised 22, 72 and 170 infantry divisions, and 54 Corps was composed of 46, 73 and 50 infantry divisions, 1/3 of the last named being still outside Odessa. 3rd Romanian Army, which now reverted to the command of Marshal Antonescu, was merely to be responsible for coastal defence on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov,